A man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is ill." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. But when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back?" On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said, "if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied, "I believe." She went back and called her sister Mary. "The teacher is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. "Take away the stone," he said. So they took away the stone. Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, and a cloth round his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go."
Do you know, when I saw what the set reading was for this morning, my heart almost sank. Not because it's not an incredible narrative that is rich with possibility and with messages, but almost the opposite. It's so rich, it's so deep. I just didn't know where to start. I could have spent a month preparing for this and probably about 6 hours talking about this passage of scripture. Well, you can rest assured I am not planning to do that this morning, but I would encourage you perhaps during this week to spend some time inhabiting this narrative from John chapter 11. Don't just look at it with the hindsight that we do today, but try and think about how this story was experienced by the people who were first involved in it. Try and step inside their shoes and experience it from their point of view, because it is an incredibly rich narrative. But my second struggle was also because of the situation that we're in, and because of what it's about, the death of Lazarus. Here we are quite literally walking through the valley of the shadow of death at the moment, really facing some awful things going on in our world. And surely what we want from a sermon today is something to take our minds off that, something to lift us out of that. But here we are, confronted again with a story of death and disease and struggle. We can't point away from it. But for me, that also raises a question. Why are we here? Why am I doing what I'm doing? Why have you tuned in to listen to it? If I'm really honest with myself, when this lockdown first happened, my first instinct was, how can we carry on? How can I help our churches carry on as they did before? How can we keep going as if the things around us weren't happening? But within that, I think there's also a challenge. What kind of God are we looking for at the moment? A God to take our mind off things? A God to make all these things go away? Because I don't think this story allows us to do that. we're confronted with the untimely death of a young man, his distraught sisters, and a whole crowd of people with all their questions and expectations and assumptions. We find Jesus at the heart of exactly the same kind of mess that we are finding ourselves in now. You know, some of the people I know have lost loved ones in recent days. As far as I know, it's not been through coronavirus, but they're still bereaved. They're still distraught. They're still crying out for God's help in the midst of their anguish. And some of us, some of you listening today, you may be ill. You maybe know people who are ill. Certainly I'm beginning now to hear the stories of people I know who know someone who is currently in hospital with some symptoms of coronavirus. And all of us are living lives that are hugely impacted by current events and facing the very real possibility that we could be struck down by this. Many of our loved ones, and some of us perhaps, are being identified as vulnerable groups. You know, a couple of weeks ago in our Latchford Learning Community, which is a group of local leaders who get together to support each other and develop their ministries, they asked us to look at what it means to be an authentic church. Now that's a big subject, but recent events have shown me that one aspect of being authentic is not about looking to God to somehow take our mind off reality, but finding God in the midst of it. Authentic faith is faith that finds God in the real world, not a God who escapes from it. And this, for me, seems to be the message that is crying out from the Gospels in these days. Do we want a God to distract us, to occupy our time and to take our mind off things? Or do we seek a God who is present in the realities of life, helping us face up to our fears and our struggles? Because that's where we find Jesus, right in the heart of this human tragedy. Right in the middle of a crowd of people with a whole range of questions and expectations. And Jesus walks right into the middle of human reality. And I think that's one of the things that we can take from this story. Jesus simply says, trust me, follow me, stay with me, and let me stay with you. And yes, that's a message that does transcend human circumstances, but not by distracting us from them, but helping us to find Jesus at the very heart of them. And so let's think for a minute about who are the people that Jesus says in this story, trust me to. Well, the first are his disciples. It's you and me, I guess. The long-standing, card-carrying Jesus followers. And you can begin to see now why we're looking at this story the week after we looked at the story of Jesus healing the man born blind. Because yet again, Jesus gets a grip on events in the face of all the arguments and expectations that people bring to him. He's got this word from Mary and Martha, and he doesn't just drop everything and come straight away. He then announces eventually that he is going to go to Judea. And immediately his disciples say to him, well, don't go. You can't go to Judea. It's not safe. They'll kill you. Whatever Jesus does, he's not going to please someone. Now, I'm going to say more about that in a minute. But I just want us to notice an almost giveaway comment in verse 5 first. Jesus loved Mary and Martha, yet he doesn't travel. He doesn't drop everything and come to them. Just because God doesn't do what we want or expect him to do doesn't mean that God doesn't love us. That real, genuine, heartfelt love is so obvious that when Jesus stands at the tomb of Lazarus later in the story, the crowd say, look how much he loved him. Like I said, when God doesn't do what we hope for or what we expect, it doesn't mean that God doesn't love us. And when he does go, he fails to do what his disciples expect and hope for. They want him to stay put. They want him to keep away from Bethany. And later in the gospel narrative, John will affirm Jesus' love for them as well. Like I said, when God doesn't do what we expect or hope, it doesn't mean that God doesn't love us. But the story begins, yet again, with one of those religious arguments that the disciples seem to fall into so often. And Jesus responds. I don't know if you noticed this, but Jesus responds exactly in the same way that he responded in John chapter 9 when he was confronted with the man born blind. And you hear those words echoed in what he says again, I am the light of the world. And again, at the heart of his response is God must be glorified. People come wanting answers, people come with their advice, people come with conflicting expectations and hopes and fears, but Jesus is not driven by our agendas, but simply that which glorifies God. So he goes. He goes to Bethany, and there, waiting for him, are Mary and Martha, distraught, bewildered, overcome by the grief of their circumstances, and Jesus goes to each of them. Martha, she's the activist. She doesn't give him a chance. As soon as she gets wind that he's even nearing the town, she's up and she's meeting him at the village boundary. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Mary, she's an introvert. She stays at home, holding her grief within her. She only finds her way to Jesus when Jesus sends for her. And she gets up and she goes so quietly and so obediently that the people aren't even sure why she's got up and gone out the door. But what's interesting, although she's so different to her sister Martha, she says exactly the same thing to Jesus. Lord, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. And I think there's so much that we can learn from that simple reality. The things we can learn about how we journey with one another through this crisis. You see, they both behave very differently, but their sentiments are exactly the same. And I don't think it's an accident that the narrative places exactly the same words in each of their mouths. We're going to behave differently in this crisis, and others will behave differently to us. But it doesn't mean that they don't harbour the same concerns and sentiments. It doesn't mean that they're not wrapped up in the same hopes and fears that we are. And perhaps there's a chance in this moment to just look sideways and offer each other the grace to find our own way through this crisis, and to make space for those who are perhaps handling it differently, and to recognise that even though that's the case, that we've all got the same intentions and needs. And Jesus says to Mary and to Martha what he says to his disciples, what he says to the crowd, what he says to everybody else impacted by this story. Trust me, believe in me, stay with me, and let me stay with you through this. But of course, we know what happens next. The reason this story is still being talked about 2,000 years later is because of this spectacular and amazing miracle as Jesus summons a 3 days dead man from the grave, and he walks in the tomb alive, and Jesus proves to us that he has the power to conquer death. Jesus gives blatant authority to the claim that he utters to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. And that's not just words, because Jesus proves that he's up to his word. So what does that mean for us? Will Jesus therefore stand and declare his authority over COVID-19? Command it to stop in its tracks? Well, do you know, he might. He's certainly got the power and authority to do it. But like I said, just because Jesus doesn't do what we hope or expect doesn't mean that he doesn't love us. Jesus invites us to trust him, believe in him, and to follow him. You see, if all this story was about was this spectacular raising of Lazarus, why did the gospel writer go to all that trouble of explaining all the detail about the waiting of the disciples, and the detail of the crowd, and the Mary and Martha, and all the different reactions? Martha going out to meet him, Mary having to be summoned, the tears, the anger, the questions. Why include all that detail? and hardly make mention of the detail of the actual miracle. Well, one reason is because that's not the end of the story. That's not where this story finishes, not really. Now, for the technical theologians among you, of whom I think there are a few, that's been signalled actually from the outset. It was being signalled last week too when we looked at John chapter 9. Remember how I keep banging on about God being glorified? Well, this is not just a word that John drops in by accident. It's a phrase that becomes more and more present as this narrative unfolds. And where do we find it eventually leading? It's when Jesus prays in the shadow of the cross, when his own untimely, unjustified death by Roman crucifixion is looming, that Jesus says, "Father, my hour has come. My hour to show the world the extent of God's glory." When John talks about God's glory, he is pointing us to the cross where Jesus is put to death. Now, for those of you who prefer a more simple approach, you don't even need to do the theology to work that out, because the story tells us. If you carry on reading in verse 45 onwards, it says this: "Therefore many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did and believed in him, but some went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done, and the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin." And it was at that meeting of the Sanhedrin that the plans are put in place that lead to Jesus' false trial and eventual execution. You see, Jesus' disciples were absolutely right. By going to Bethany, by doing what he did in the face of Lazarus' death, Jesus set in motion a series of events that led to his own death. There are no simple answers in the midst of human reality. One person's hopes and expectations might well be asking God to fly in the face of someone else's. And that certainly takes place here. And that takes me right back to where I began. What kind of a God are we looking for? A God to distract us and take our mind off current events? A God who can make them go away? Or a God who will enter into them and be found at their very heart? We preach Christ crucified, says the Apostle Paul a few years later. Not what the Greeks want, a God who answers questions and fits our frames of logic. Not what the Jews want, a God who overcomes our struggles and fits our expectations. But Christ crucified. God with us. God reaching out from eternity into the midst of our human situation. For Jesus, reaching into that heart of human circumstances was a costly and painful reality. It led to his death. But through that, it also led to our salvation. That wasn't something that his followers worked out at the time. For them, with all their conflicting demands and fears and expectations, they could not have imagined why the events that were taking place at the time were taking place. But through them, the message was the same. Trust me, believe in me, follow me. And this Jesus speaks to us from eternity and for eternity and says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Trust me, believe in me, follow me."